Kimberly,
Hi.
hi. Welcome to the Claima Stories podcast presented by Vista. So happy to have you in town. How you feeling?
I feel great. I'm excited to be here.
You good to be here?
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm good to have you. You know, I have a question I've been wanting to ask. It's on my mind. I've been thinking about it with a lot of folks in general. But as a creative, as an artist, and many other identities, what's one thing that you do a day that has impacted your life over years for the better?
One thing that I do a day that has impacted my life for the better over years. I mean, I think going to bed, like I've learned in the last few years how critical sleep is. Like I think especially as creatives, and I think within the context of Black culture, we are expected to produce so much.
Constantly.
And you even think about like Nas, like sleep is the cousin of death. And I'm like, no. Like, not sleeping really makes you like the bedfellow of death. Like you have to restore yourself. And so I think that for me has been the most pertinent. I'm not a person of many routines up until recently, but I would say if I had to look at something, it's definitely that.
It'd be that.
Yeah.
I always find it funny when you think about creatives and artists, like the way we think about sleep is the complete opposite of the way athletes think about sleep. And athletes, it's all about rest. It's all about recovery. It's like, do it, get your reps in, play a game, blah, blah, blah. But rest is probably one of the key essentials. And it's just weird to me that we don't think about it that way. But
I mean, we're applauded for not sleeping.
Yeah.
Celebrated for the grind and celebrated for the sacrifices. And I don't understand how we got there.
We've seen it over and over, and so people just went along with it and thought that's what needed to happen to be successful.
Yeah.
Probably. Now, you have this nickname, the Museum Mommy.
Yes.
Where'd that nickname come from?
Yeah, I love it as a nickname. It's my username.
It's a username.
It's actually funny because I ran into someone yesterday, actually, and she was like, do you go by? And then it was like a white woman. She's like, Museum. And I was like, no, this is my username. But I came up with it in 2012. I was initially really interested in museums and museum communications. I studied art history and Black studies in college, and we had this program where you could do a museum's concentration. And my concentration was specifically on communications. And so I did all these case studies of different museums, and I utilized social media to execute what became my thesis.
Right.
And so I used Twitter and Tumblr and all these different things. My original username was Maud Mammy, inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha. This book that is, I think, very singular in its approach to its focus on Black women and Black women's interiority. And then one of my mentors has this account called Museum Nerd. And then I eventually became Museum Mammy. Do I regret it? Maybe, but it's who I am now.
Oh, yeah.
It's too late.
I always think it's hilarious, though, when people, like, run up on you, and they're like, but then they don't know how to.
Exactly.
And you're like, it's not that deep.
And, of course, Mammy historically is a term, like many other pejorative terms, that comes with a lot of weight. But for me, I think I really like the idea of being able to reclaim it because it is a very powerful position at the end of the day. Like thinking about domestic work, thinking about that labor that Black women have historically done. I don't know that we've societally really like given the flowers for it and extended our gratitude.
No way.
And so for me, I've always seen it as this like powerful reclamation. And so yeah, Museum Mammy.
I love it. Take me back to childhood, right? So I know you grew up in New Jersey,
Yes.
right? Which is Orange, New Jersey.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's, a stone throw away from New York.
Yeah.
How did that, and seeing New York, did it ever become a muse for you as you were growing up? Like, how was that influence?
Yeah, I mean, closer than New York is Newark, New Jersey, the home of the Black arts movement. And I think one of the amazing things specifically about being Black and growing up where I did is that culture is so deeply intertwined with how we're all raised. Like I remember very specifically when NJ Pack opened, which is like our performing arts center, and we would go there for concerts, and it was just so quotidian to have this relationship with culture, which I'm realizing as I get older and as I talk to specifically young people, that's not always the case. And so whether it's a muse or not, I don't know. It's so much more like DNA to the point where it took me halfway through my college education to realize I even wanted to work in the arts because it was just something I always loved.
You were like, it was just always around. You didn't think it was
exactly. I didn't think I had to professionalize
unusual.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you
Or that
think
I
is
could.
absent for some of the young people today?
Yeah. I think in general, everything is so professionalized for the next generations that are coming up. I was in the car ride home with my friend Nikki, who's a fantastic cultural figure in fashion. And Nikki and I were talking about hobbies and how hard it is to find a hobby that you don't instinctually monetize. And I think for those who are younger than us, the Gen Z, Gen Alpha, that's all they kind of know. It's like you don't knit, you have a knitting business. You don't cook, you're a chef.
Right.
And so that space to experiment, to play, and to fail, I think is, because of social media largely, is like really being robbed from them.
Why do you think that's an important thing? Like, and I think we understand kind of how that's happening today because this is a generation that grew up with these tools available. Our generation grew up like asking for like, can we monetize our skill, right? So it was always the last thing really that we thought about, and maybe it wasn't the last thing, and maybe more so a delayed access to. Whereas they have readily accessible to monetizing whatever they do. What is maybe so wrong with that when it comes to just being an artist?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways that it's difficult. I think so much about like Teen Vogue in 2016, 2018. You saw the build up and rhetoric around these incredible young women. Like I think about the cover with Yara Shahidi and Rowan Blanchard and seeing your peers like in that way. I just don't know that we had that same thing or that level of intimacy or that day-to-day contact where the compare and despair is just so, I think, so much more palpable for those who are just a bit younger than us and those who really grew up in the context of social media. Like as a millennial, I remember a specific time before we had internet. I remember dial-up internet. And then I remember, like, I was in college by the time I had social media. Like, fully, like, the frontal cortex was formed.
You were formed.
You know what I'm saying? And so to then have that be so everyday life, to be able to see, like, what Beyonce had for lunch is a very bizarre phenomenon. And I think puts this unrealistic pressure for success because you don't see the nitty gritty, the behind the scenes. I don't know that you would know to even privilege it. And when I talk to mentees, I'm like, this beginning of your career, one, is the time when you're going to be able to get the most help probably for the rest of your life.
Yeah, you have more people that are willing to help you simply for the fact that you're young.
That's it. And it unfortunately expires, and it's not even about being emergent, because if you make a career pivot later, people aren't checking for you like that. And then two, I think the conversation and language we have around failure is inherently failing and flawed. But I really value that idea of being able to work in silo before you're immediately selling something, because I love scrappy. I'm not scrappy. I'm not scrappy like that. I like to be precise. And to be able to execute something on a stage, for me, requires a lot of privacy.
When you say precise and not scrappy, what does that look like to you?
I just like high production. I'm the least DIY. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a character flaw, but it's true of like, okay, I'm going to find all the partners that will help me bring this vision to light in the exact way that I want it to be. And I don't really compromise on that. And I wish I could. I really do wish I could.
Sometimes you're like, I really could get this out.
Yeah, but perfection is the enemy of
where does that come from? Like, does that come from family? Does that come from observing, other artists that you have admired? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. I never actually really thought about it. I think because I'm a person who has been somewhat fortunate in terms of visibility, let's say. Yeah. I know that I want to do things at a certain caliber. And I think too, as a person who sits at the intersection of a number of marginalized identities, I love to remind people that we deserve the nicest things. And so I like to demystify that, if that's the word I'm
Yeah.
looking for, you know?
Yeah.
But I love to just be like, no, like it can be excellent,
Yeah.
and you don't have to compromise. Which is not to take any, like I was saying, I envy people who have the DIY spirit, but for me, I'm on the other end of the spectrum where I'm just like, everything is very nice, and you deserve very nice.
And I think it's just preference.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I don't think there's a right or wrong to any of these approaches. It's just like I prefer the way I show up to be like this.
Yeah.
You know, when I think of my mother growing up, it was such a thing for me to leave the house looking a certain way.
Yeah.
Right? Hair a certain way.
Yeah.
Clothing a certain way. Because in her eyes, it was like if you showed up differently, then, you know, society might, you know, have these thoughts. About
Society will.
They will.
They will.
Have
The proof is in the pudding. Yeah.
Speaking of identity, right? You've been vocal about having different identities, right? But I think first and foremost, Black woman, queer, and then also a nerd, right? What's been your journey of identity and being who you are today?
Yeah. I think that's part of, like, it's a perfect anchor from the last thing that we were just talking about. There's such public scrutiny for us. And I think for a very long time, I've reckoned with that and just realized that, like, I cannot get lost in macro level conceptions of who or how I should be, but really thinking about finding my own identity and talking through my identity because I know that it resonates with the people I'm actually trying to reach. Like, I've recently talked a lot more about mental health and specifically talking to young people about mental health, because this is something I also know when I was a young person, I needed permission for. Because you think that you're supposed to be perfect, or you have these examples on social media, or you have family who are like, you're fine. You just sad, you know?
You're fine.
You're good.
Brush it off.
And so to be able to say, like, this is who I am, and I also am successful. This is who I am, and I'm content with my life. Like, fuck success. Like, I'm actually really happy with where I'm at, and all these other things are going on at the same time. That to me is really where the development of and sharing of my identity has come from, not from like the facetious of it. I feel like so many people became Black in 2020, whole other conversation. I've always been this way. But really to be able to say, like, this is this luminance that I want to show, this is this echo, and if it lands for you, that's dope. And then you know that you don't have to compromise on that part of yourself when you're walking into spaces.
Yeah. Go a little deeper into the 2020 comment about everyone decided to become Black.
You know
what
exactly what I'm talking about. No, because it's wild. Like, it's wild to see this there was never an emergency, I guess is where I want to start. I think that 2020 and corporate societal responses implied that conversations around inequity and disparity could be resolved in a summer. It was like, oh, we just weren't thinking about this before. And so we're going to throw money at the problem, which is what we're seeing now. It's like the backlash of it, where these budgets are being shifted, and it was never exclusively an issue about money. And I say 2020, a lot of people became radicalized, let's say is probably the most generous way I can say it, because there was more money towards it. And so people were writing different scripts or taking different photos or making different art because it was easier to remunerate based on identity probably than moments before. And probably in the most significant way, I would say, just because of the way that media is working nowadays. And it was really disheartening in some ways to see, because I'm like, you know, you look to your left and your right, and not that you have to be like at every march, like these are not the qualifications, but to see people who have almost never thought about helping others suddenly doing it because they were getting a check. Like, where's the integrity?
That's the thing we're talking about today. Is like, we, on one end of it, I'm appreciative of anyone wanting to learn more and get involved. But what you mentioned are budgets that are shifting. You mentioned that there are similar people who did do that aren't talking about it anymore. They're on to whatever the next thing is that they can be behind to look good. And ultimately, we're still the ones sitting here having these conversations and still doing what we were doing before, because that's how it always ends up, it seems like. But activism has essentially always been a part of your work. And in your book, What I Know About Art, you mentioned that you mentioned that your first practice of this was in art activism. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a funny thing to talk about activism. Like, it's such a strange tension, I think, in communities because we see activism as sacrifice. We always align those two things together, where you can't make a certain amount of money, or like you even see like, oh, you can't buy a house, you know, like these things that will make you more authentic as an activist. And I think I've also fallen victim to that, where for a long time I didn't identify as such. I mean, even today I kind of don't, because I feel like it pinholes in this very particular way. And it makes radical something that's not. Like, my career is built on doing everything I can to support the communities that I value, in many ways the communities that I come from. There's nothing radical about that. You know, like, the communities I come from have been disenfranchised, but I didn't do that disenfranchisement. But what I can do is speak directly to them and advocate for them.
Yeah.
But then, of course, like, the relationship between advocacy and activism is then where I'm like, okay, but I guess that is activism.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah. But it's strange because I'm like, if I was a white dude, no one would give a shit.
No one. It would never be mentioned.
It would never be mentioned. It's so normalized for particular identities to do and utilize these mechanisms. And when some of us come in, it's seen as disruption. And disruption is the one that really like grinds my gears. Because I'm like, disruptive to what?
Yeah. To what, the status quo, or what wasn't being done in the first place that should have been happening all along?
Right. Like,
why is this disruptive?
Exactly. why are you gagging? Like, it's not that deep.
Talk to me a little bit about museums, right? Like, and especially at a very young age, like you were in museums and you had an appreciation and still have appreciation for them. What I think a lot of young people may get into these spaces and they may not feel like they belong in those spaces, or for lack of better terms, they may feel like they're boring because they don't know how they necessarily connect to them.
Yeah.
How do you kind of feel a sense of calm being in those spaces?
Yeah. I mean, very simply, I just like quiet. Like, it really started with this obsession with quiet. And I always felt like museums were the most quiet place, which is so interesting now working in museums because they're loud as hell. But I think when I was a kid, it was this respite space. And I think I've always wanted, especially in the beginning of my career, I wanted to share that space for reprieve. But I think that there is, of course, there's an impetus on people who work in museums to make those spaces safer for visitors, whether that's through like capital A accessibility or lowercase a accessibility, making sure that there's information that's made available to potential constituents and visitors. And I think, for me, I don't know. It's not something I can easily explain. It's just a space that I've always loved and a space that I've always felt good in. And for me, I just want to share that in a very. It sounds so like
it's
tweet.
Sometimes it's just like it's simplified, and sometimes it's just to your point. I just felt like I belonged there.
Yeah.
You know, you just felt like it was something that spoke to you, even if it wasn't as quiet as you initially thought.
Yeah, and it's that thing too where it's like I think a lot about, like, the World Cup was recently, and I was not raised in a family that touched football, soccer, like at all. It just wasn't like, we're a basketball family. It's like the W or the NBA. And at any rate, I was really fortunate because I got to go to Qatar, and then I spent some of the games on the continent. And so I was like in Johannesburg watching the Morocco game. I was in Ghana watching the finale. See, I'm not a sports person. Or whatever the last game is. And
or the final.
The last, like the penalty kicks, we were there, like. And it was so wild because it was like planes were grounded. Like, it was just this like global phenomenon, whatever. And people just like knew everything that had happened in previous World Cups, like knew the players' names and all these different things. I don't have that, you know, like I don't know actors, I don't know actresses, I don't know athletes, but I know artists. And I know that that's the space that like my brain wants to retain that information. And so that was a lot of it for me too, especially in relationship to course study. And I just, I'm like, I love sharing that because it's equally important culturally. And I think seen as so inaccessible, but like, you know, like one of my favorite players is Basquiat, you know, like, and that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It's a part of how we grow. It's part of learning identities. It's a part of becoming who we're going to become. And I think speaking of like those inputs that help us kind of figure those things out, college can be one of those big opportunities and moments in life where you're really learning new things about yourself, learning things about other people, taking in new interests. And for your schooling, you went to Smith College, right? And at Smith, you tried a lot of different things, and you majored in art history. Did you consider that art would be a career at that point?
My parents didn't. I had a bit of like a windy experience, which is actually why I really love talking to college age students, because I think that there's such a pressure on them to figure it out. And like even recently, the last time I was in Portland, I was here for this really incredible press trip that Nike did, and Marley Diaz was there. And Marley's 18, and she's in her freshman year at Harvard, which is wild. Talking to someone who is 15 years younger than you. But like even talking to her in that student body, they have to figure it out. It's like, are you going to be the next Zuckerberg? Like, and you simply don't. And I think all of us who are like not 18 anymore, like your scope of the world is so small that you can't possibly determine all these other things.
No way.
And you shouldn't have to.
No.
And for me, just to backtrack as well, my family was not a family that was like, you have to grow up and be a doctor. That was the best thing my parents did. Like, period. They were never like, they were never like, you have to do that. They were just like, the highest premium for me and my cousins, I think, was just happiness. Like finding the thing that you love to do. And so when I got to college, I had this free reign to be like, I started off pre-med because I loved that and loved math and was a math major. And then math became the more that I studied math, the further I went away from humanities and like the realities of the world. And I didn't like that. I didn't like that pivoting out. And so then I kind of anchored back in, was doing engineering because it was kind of a more practical way to utilize my investment in STEM. And then because of my financial situation, I was putting myself through school. I had multiple jobs, and then also was doing all these extracurricular activities. I did radio, I did community service, and then I was on our Black Student Council as an arts and culture chair. And so I was just doing too much shit to be able to.
You're doing a lot.
Like engineering is the activity. And so I went from engineering, architecture, took my first art history class, and then was like, this is it.
I was like, this is what felt so familiar growing up, and like, this is the thing.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned that your parents were a little soft on that.
Yeah, they didn't love, oh, my child's going to be an engineer, now my child's going to be an art historian. Like, the pivot is not, like, that's not.
It's like, hey, I don't know about this one.
Yeah, exactly.
But I imagine they've come
they
along,
love it.
Right?
Yeah, now they're good. And it's interesting, too, because, like, my family, like, especially my dad's side of the family, always was going to museums and stuff like that. And so it wasn't so strange. It wasn't so estranged. I have a family that will be like, let's go to see, like, my aunt bought tickets to see Simone Lee speak at the ICA Boston because she's already on that on her own. Like I sent the link and she was like, babe, I already got the tickets.
I was like, all right.
Thank you. Like, thank you for making sure it's on my radar, but like, I'm good. And so I think the pivot just from them wanting me to have financial security was the critique more so than what I actually did.
So when did you find out kind of what the responsibilities were for, say, being a curator?
Yeah.
Like, when did that start to come into the picture?
I mean, every day I'm still learning, to be quite honest. Like, it shifts so much. And then, two, I came through such a side door into the art world because of my work in digital communications. I think if I had taken a more traditional track, I would have a very different answer. But because I went in through comms and have always been a person who's invested in, like, multiplicitous ways of working and learning, every project has its own kind of tenor and flavor and what it requires. But I think that that's what makes working in the arts so dope, is that there's this really beautiful clash that's constantly happening between precedent and innovation. And when you can kind of have both of those working in a romantic and synchronistic way, you can make really incredible things.
I love the way you put that. It's not something you would commonly think of. But it's also interesting to hear that you're like, no, and I'm also like still like, learning these different things. It's
I don't know what the hell I'm doing. Don't let
none of us do.
Don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, don't let anybody fool you. Nobody knows what you're doing. That's the strangest thing about being an adult. Like, you spend your entire youth wanting to be an adult, and the only thing that changes is bills. Like,
That's it.
That's
it. That's it. And half of us still haven't figured that out.
I'm like, whew, yeah, I was tired. My CPA was like, so I guess we're getting the extension. I'm like, yes, we are.
Yes, we are. I'm not doing this right now.
Right now, please.
So a couple things started to happen after college, right? So you worked at an art organization called Creative Time. You managed and started the Met's Instagram account.
I didn't start it.
You didn't start it?
I did not start it.
No.
No, I didn't start it.
How do you know how long before it had been?
I would say it was, I would have to fact check, but it was somewhere between 2010, I would say. Mm-hmm. And I started at the Met in 2015.
Okay. So it was there.
It was there.
And you took over, man.
I think I would like actually like my heart would fall out of my body if I had
the one starting it.
That's so much pressure.
I was found interesting during that time when like social media managers started to become a part of organizations, was that a lot of these managers were like, I don't know, 24, like, kids, essentially. Yeah. And they're the ones who are the faces of these brands, and these CMOs didn't even realize it. They're like, no one's looking at these billboard campaigns. They're literally checking Twitter and Instagram, and that's how they're finding out about your brand. So it's crazy, when you think about it that way. But anyway, I went on a tangent. But
no, it's a great tangent actually, because I mean that's how I started doing what I was doing and doing social media. It's not because I love to be a copywriter. It was because it was this tool that allowed you to bring the museum to people. It's like when I started a blog called Black Contemporary Art in 2011. And for me, it was like, I can bring Black artists to folks. Like you can open up your Tumblr app and then this artist will be introduced to you. You don't have to wait until that museum finally has their first show of Black, you don't have
our first Black exhibit.
First one. And it's like, you don't have to wait for that, or you don't, like I always was, especially now, like I never want anybody to work as hard as I did to find out the information that I found out. And I feel that way in general whenever I find anything that brings me joy and pleasure. I don't want anybody to have to work for that. And so I think social media is this ideal medium for making that labor less intensive, because it allows people who come after you to then take whatever energy they would have had and find something better. And then we just, it's like it compounds on itself.
Yeah. It's, speaking of social media and how at that time you were able to leverage it in a way that, like you just said, you democratized it in a way, and you also made it, you reduced a lot of friction for folks to be introduced to art and understand the value of the artists and what they're bringing to our society. And so around that time, as we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to go a little bit more into it, like that pocket of like anywhere from 2005, 2006 into like 2013, 2014, 2015, those platforms were vastly different than I would say today, 2023. How, when you think about that, what's your point of view of social media today?
I'm more in old social. It was so sick. Like early Tumblr days was so sick. Like I still have friends from that time, and it's so wild. Like running into somebody in the wild where you're like, oh my God, like I knew your deepest thoughts in 2020, like 2013. Or like in the DMs going crazy. It's a very different time now. It's weird. Or even TikTok. Like TikTok baffles me, because TikTok was the first platform that really came to visibility at the scale for me personally in my own journey, that when I wasn't working in social anymore. And so I didn't have to master it. Like I could just be a visitor. And it's just wild to watch those stars be born, or to think about people who have 200 million followers that you've never heard of.
You've never heard of.
You've never heard of.
So it makes me wonder, I'm like, are those real, or why don't we know?
The following is some, I mean, I think the numbers, whatever, it's a whole other conversation about bots and all of that. But the impact that people have is real. It's just respecting that, like, we live on a planet with all these different people, and everybody has their own unique interests, and the people that they're listening to and looking to. There is this vastness, but it is interesting to see those things quantified in the way that social media does. But where we are now, I mean, I honestly couldn't tell you, but it is interesting as a voyeur now, more so than a professional in it, just to see like how rapidly things are changing. Like when they changed the character count on Twitter, bonkers. I never would have in my life thought that they would do that, because it's just like that's the thing that made this platform what it.
140 characters.
You know what I'm saying? And then it's like you just never know.
And some people only need 140 characters.
Some people should only be reduced to 140 characters, very specific. And you weren't in the trenches with me if you weren't trying to write out a whole tweet about an artwork and then a link takes like 23 of those characters.
Oh, look.
So you got to work backwards from that, and you still got to abide by the style guide. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's spaces that my brain has touched that like no one should, which is why no one wants to work in social anymore, which is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, it's not as attractive as it once was.
No.
But I think the beauty of when you were in it from a professional standpoint, it also connects to you becoming this go-to source for Black art. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that?
I feel strange about it because I'm definitely one of many, which I have to just say compulsively, because I definitely, I know very intimately how just a kernel of the work that I do in relationship to the mountains that have been moved before me and the mountains that are being moved currently. We're in such a dope moment in terms of Black art and Black artists. And like, I look at peers like Storm Asher and Hannah Traore and Sierra Britton, who are like young Black women who are, you know, making their own gallery work happen. I'm not alone in the gallery field, like on the more like large scale gallery side. Museum curators, museum professionals, educators, like they're killing it right now. And so it's really beautiful to be a part of a larger community and to understand that the labor that we're doing, the momentum, is a really profoundly beautiful thing that's happening, and that none of us have to subscribe exclusively by resilience.
Yeah. Wow. It's beautiful when that can happen.
Yeah.
As you've continued to go on in your career, you've also continued as an artist, yet you've also partnered with corporations. And sometimes partnering with corporations, it can feel daunting because you can feel this pressure to maybe diminish your own voice. How do you make sure that you stay you in those circumstances?
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you. I feel like of all the compliments that can ever happen for me, like my favorite is like, you didn't change. Because I don't like to compromise. I don't think you have to compromise to get a check. I just don't think that. I think that there is a patience that's required on the behalf of both you and the entity that you're working with. You want to make sure that you're aligning morality-wise. So those are the first two, of course, important things. But I think for me too, I realized that I don't want to exclusively work in museums and in art because art is such a part of everyday life. It's a part of this like heartbeat and life force. And so doing it exclusively in museums and galleries was just never going to work for me. And I've always, like, especially in the beginning, saw brand work as this opportunity to demystify a relationship with it. And then the more I did it, I realized that like so many of these brands have art collections or have relationships with art. And so I thought I was like showing up and doing something, and I'm not, you know, like I'm really not. Like even like Gap has a collection, like a relationship with SF. Like there's these interesting ways that you just wouldn't know if you weren't in deep. And I love those intersections, or even, you know, as a benefit of the way that relationships to conversations around equity and just thinking about marginalized bodies in space, being able to also be in that room and help as a catalyst for brands who are trying to think about the language that they should use or how they should get involved. Or like, I'm very honored to be a person that's on the list that people are like, okay, we want to do something legitimate with a legitimate person. And then being like, oh, like I'm one of 5, or like, oh, and then we're also going to make this donation here. Yeah. That kind of stuff is really rewarding, and not just like the facetious, like in my Calvins, you know, like, because you can do that, and like no shade to that.
You can do that, no shade.
That, but like,
yeah. There's always something more.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the patience and not willing to compromise on your voice, who you are, and then the patience that I'm guessing like, well, if it doesn't work with this particular partner, there's someone else that's probably a better fit for you. How does someone practice and develop that if it's not something that feels natural to them, and they more so feel a panic to make a move because they feel like I might not have a move tomorrow? How do you find that maybe that confidence and courage that you could pass on something?
Trust. Trust. I know exactly how much money I've passed on. Intimately. And that's just part of it. That's just part of it. I mean, I think for me, it's like, I don't know that there's a dollar sign I can put on pride and self-respect. But at the same time, I know exactly how much money I've passed on because that is a material reality of my life. I don't come from a lot of money. And so like that acute awareness is very real. But I also know that I've been asked to do some unscrupulous things. And I just like, I can't, you know, I just I wouldn't be able to look at myself, and I wouldn't want people who are looking to me to see me make that move and think it's okay. Because I know in my heart of hearts it's not.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you're the one that has to sit with it, right?
Exactly.
Like it stays with you. You're like, I don't want to feel this way. Let's talk a little bit about Black cultural production, and the word production in itself, right? It carries a lot of different meanings. What does that mean to you?
I think it's magic. Like, I love it as like how I can mainstream the word magic and people don't look at me like I'm too woo-woo. I love creating possibilities for magic. Like, I don't believe in Black girl magic, period. Like, I don't believe in like the mystical relationship of Black people in the world. Like, I think that that's a really dangerous path. But for me, I think that there's something really magic in encounter and lowering those barriers to access. And so for me, production is really setting up ways for people to access each other, to access information, to access spaces such that that magic can happen. Because you can coordinate to the T, but you don't know what's actually going to happen. And making that space for me is the production.
What would you think are some of the best practices in that, right? That while, like you said, you don't know what's going to happen, but as you're trying to curate in a way and think about in a way that is inviting and opening, how do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the first principle is access, like thinking about how to not just like work backwards. Like, I think we're in this space now where we think about access in this like retrospective thing where it's like, or people who might need an interpreter or might need to know how wide a door is, like that person makes that request and then we, do it. It's like, no, like to be a really excellent producer, I think you anticipate all of these things and anticipate that you are going to be wrong. Like you can't always win. Like, it's not a winning game, but having that challenge to yourself always to be like, oh, this is a community that might need this. We should have water bottles. We should have benches. We should have enough toilet paper. Like, getting into the granular things to me, I think, is how to have something that's really successful, because when you're trying to guide too much on the creative level, that's so much ego too, right? Like, if you're bringing together people to do something cultural, like that person gonna know more than you, and that's okay.
You gotta rock back. You're like, this your thing.
Let it happen. Because if you feel too much, or like if you over research and try to put words in people's mouths, like, it's actually just such a waste of their time.
Yeah. And it's like, why would you invite them to do that to them?
Right.
Yeah.
Not when you could have like done the things on their rider, got them there on time, and then they could just shine.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's interesting. That's excellent advice, actually, too. It's just like, let them do their thing. Do what they ask for. Like, create the space. Roll.
Let have. Yeah.
So you're full time at Pace Gallery, right, in Chelsea. Take us into what that day to day is like, right, for someone who may not know like what you do in that role. What is that like in a day to day?
Yeah. So I was recently promoted,
hey.
Which I'm very excited about. I'm a curator at Pace Gallery, and we represent over 100 artists globally. We have spaces across the globe. My title and the work that I do is really specifically working directly with artists. to help them realize their projects, to help them think about their archive, both retrospectively and future forward. I really wanted to go into the gallery space because I think a lot about what it means to have more durational relationships at this point in my career. I think having a background in comms, you're so project-based, and it's so temporal, the relationship that you have with artists, and I really don't like that. Like, I love working a bit slower, and I do not, like, I say I don't know what I'm doing because I really took a huge risk career-wise pivoting at this point, because it is not my background to do curatorial work in the traditional sense. And so every day I'm learning, and I'm really honored to be in a space that I'm on a team that, like, there is intrinsic trust and support, and there is information share. So yeah, and so just to, I think that demystifies it as much as I can possibly do. Like, galleries are so strange because it's like, it is the commercial side of the art world is probably the most opaque. There are clients, there are artists, there's a number of stipulations that go into it, but at the end of the day, my specific work is setting up our artists for success.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's, you're like, if I do that,
Yeah.
everything else is good.
Yeah.
What, you said this is a newer, you felt like you took a risk, making this transition.
Yeah.
What have you felt has been transferable from your previous experiences?
I think my patience, and I don't know. I don't know what I did, and I don't know what I do, but I'm very thankful that I have had the relationships with artists that I have, because I feel really welcomed into artist studios in a way that I just want to continue to earn. I don't know what that is, but being able to talk in a real way with artists, no matter what their practice is something that I have always experienced and I hope to always experience. And that's probably the most transferable skill, is that I know I'm going to go into someone's space with the utmost respect, met with the utmost respect, and something really magical, or that transference is going to happen. And I think to be able to do that, especially on the commercial side, is really valuable, because at the end of the day, like, we are tasked with the sustainability of someone's career and their life, their kids, their dog. Like, we dog sitting. Like, there's certain ways that we show up that really require trust. And so I think that's probably, if I had to define it.
The trust and the patience are key. And I can imagine, as an artist, you would want that out of someone that's in your role. You want to have that relationship.
Yeah.
In addition to that, you're also an author, right? You've written, 2 books. What Do I Know About Art and Black Futures? What inspired you or motivated you to want to do both?
Yeah. So the first one that got published is This Is What I Know About Art with Penguin Teen, as a part of this series of books called the Pocket Change Collective. So we got this missive from Penguin Teen to create books for the YA audience in relationship to activism, which is funny because I was just saying I don't like activism. But through a conversation with my agent, Jamie Carr, who is like one of the great loves of my life, we kind of came around to this concept of just writing what I know, because I was really intimidated by the process. I've done a lot of critical writing, or writing about artists, or doing interviews. Those things are relatively easy to do once you decide you want to do them. But writing like a book and then writing something for young people, I think is exceptionally difficult, because you want to make something that's really easy to read. And I think it's hard to make things easy. Like, even talking to friends who have written children's books, like, it's painstaking because you want to get through this narrative, but you can't do it in a bunch of pages, and you can't use a specific set of words, but you also don't want to infantilize and discredit your audience. Like, all of these things come into play. And so for me, when I was writing my book, I just wanted to demystify the path that I've taken. That felt like the easiest and most relatable way to talk to that Gen Alpha group, and to say, like, there was nothing that I did that was like super out of the box or completely impossible to do. I was really passionate about social media, really passionate about art, threw everything I had into it, and it worked. And through that, I also held on to my beliefs. These are some of the major critical cultural moments that happened at the same time. These are the ways that I couldn't contend with them. These are the ways that I did. And through 8,000 words, that's how that book came to be.
What did you learn about yourself through that process?
How much I lie to myself. is wild.
What do you mean?
No, because I think that it's difficult to be. I think it's difficult to be honest with yourself in every moment and how everything impacts you. I think one of the unfortunate realities of what it means as well to be Black and alive is to still be expected to show up to work. And so going through like my social media posts versus like what I knew I was doing in real time, like someone was shot yesterday and I'm still showing up to work and doing the best I can. That's so wild. And there's such, for me as a very deeply sensitive person, like there's a part of yourself you have to really shut down. And I don't think I ever saw that until I was going back and really looking at myself, especially with some distance.
Yeah. You know what's wild to me is that stuff will happen, right? Like in our society, right? Someone that looks like us, we identify with, will get murdered. Or there's something that happens on the news and it feels like a complete attack on our mothers and our sisters. And yet, no one asks you how you feel about it, and the expectation is that you're just going to show up the next day and that you're going to perform as well or above what you continue or have done previously.
Yeah. And then also too, like concept. A layer of that as well is like, do you want them to talk to you about it?
Well, yeah, that's true too. Because sometimes I'm like, I want them to mention it, but I don't want to have a conversation.
Right. Like I don't want to go into it with you, but it's good to, like, we're not going to pretend this isn't happening. Yeah. But I don't need to get into it on a granular level.
Sometimes it's just the acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most interesting shifts in the art world to me personally has been this introduction of NFTs and also the introduction of AI art. And I had an interview last year with Tyler, Creator, and I asked him about NFTs. And he had some choice words about how he felt about NFTs. How do you feel those are starting to become a part of the art world and shaping the art world, and do they have a place, a space, etc.?
Yeah, I think as a person who has a career, that was made possible by technological shifts in the art world, all I can do is take them all very seriously. Because some people didn't think that there should be websites.
Yeah.
And then there was someone who didn't think that there should be a Twitter. And then there was, like, there's so many ways that we historically, for good reason in some senses, have been reticent to invite new technology in. NFTs are hard because NFTs came in with such a promise that we now see hasn't always come out. Like this idea of community or this idea of disruption or community building, like, I don't know that it's been able to deliver on all those things, but it's also such a nascent, like it's not in its prime yet, you know what I'm saying? And so it's hard to be able to be like, absolutely no.
Yeah. I call it its goofy stage.
It's silly goofy. Yeah, it's just in its silly goofy stage. It's just a little silly goose trying to figure itself. Like AI is the silliest of the gooses.
Talk about it.
Because it's horrifying.
Yeah.
It's horrifying, actually. Like, I am horrified by it, and I make no mistake about that. But yeah, I just kind of am like, trust in the process.
Yeah, you kind of have to. It's to your same point. It's like websites when those first came and .com when it first came. Like there was so much stuff that was kind of in there and distracting, and then as it started to mature, you started to see the utility in it. And I hope at some point, we will begin to see, we've seen glimpses of it. We'll start to see kind of more clear of like what is here to remain and what can artists in the world really utilize from the standpoint of AI and NFTs and that promise of community and also ownership in the hands of artists. You mentioned early in our conversation around that first question I asked you around a choice that you make every day. And you had mentioned that routine hadn't really been a part of your life until recent. What changed, and what did you start to bring in from a routine standpoint? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think I always just was really hard on myself and was just like, you're not a routine person. You could not possibly have a routine. It was like from that like inner saboteur, self-critical, like you're such a mess. And I think that my internal dialogue with myself really was always that. And it just doesn't serve me anymore. Like I don't find any pleasure in self-criticism in that way anymore. And especially in the last year, it's just been a year of like, you want to do it, just do it. Like I recently became a runner because I, for so long, wanted to run and told myself I couldn't do it. And I'm like, bro, you're the only person who's saying you can't do it.
You're the only one saying it, yeah.
It's like I was the only person who was like, you can't do routines. Like I think anybody looking at my life would think that I'm very regimented and organized. And then on the inside, I'm like, no, you're not. And it's like, why am I what? Like, where is this coming from? And so for me, yeah, I've just been like, okay, let's just try. And really in the last year especially, like, let's just try this today. So like I just went on one run, and then now I run, and I'm like running races. And then, I was like, oh, let me just try meditating. And then, I get into 2 weeks of meditation. So it's very like R&D on how I want.
Yeah, you're trying to see how it feels, how it goes. I'm a runner, by the way, as well.
It's the best.
It's me, and it's peaceful, and it's just get out the door.
It's so stupid how great it is. Like it actually is frustrating how fantastic it is as an activity. And then races, people just clapping for you.
I know, for no reason.
Expect it. Like I ran my first 5K, and just like a silly, goofy little thing, and people just see you running, they clapping for you. I'm like, this is dope. This is such a fun way to be human today.
Yeah, I love it. It's those endorphins that, and I find that it I don't know, it sets me up for when I get into my craft. I feel really great, like mentally, physically, like I feel really good. So it's cool to hear that, and the meditation thing too. That's a newer journey for me, but I kind of picked my head up this week, and I was like, wow, I've been doing this every morning for like a couple weeks. Like this is crazy. I even think about it. Yeah. It's just a thing now. Yeah,
no, it's dope. It's dope when you prioritize and take on those little voices before you tell yourself you can't or you shouldn't. It's like, you didn't even try. Like for me, I'm always like, bro, you didn't even try, but you decided you couldn't.
You decided before
like this
you tried.
This is such immature behavior. Yeah. Just take yourself seriously. And this is such a big doctrine of how I live and how I tell other people to do stuff. And I'm like, wow, you're really not practicing what you preach. To take yourself seriously, even on the minutia level of the things that also like you do for yourself. Like I think 2020 and living through and surviving this pandemic collectively, I think in many ways, like it's our first, so for some, unfortunately, their first proximity to disability, or first, like, and I'm like, wow, I can't imagine not thinking about these things. And so I'm glad, I'm like, yay, now we're thinking about these things. It's unfortunate, the reason and context. But all that to say, it, I think, has invited a lot of us to prioritize and reconsider the ways that we live our lives. And so, yeah, just trying things out is a big part of being human.
Yeah.
Hot take.
Hot take. So you've spoken a little bit about what you were saying to yourself and how you want to take control over those voices. What do you want people to say about Kimberly Drew when it's all said and done?
The like sassy person me wants to be like, I don't care. I mean, I guess there's a question of like legacy, right? I don't know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I'm living the best version of the life that I have with the cards that I was dealt. And I hope that people understand that that is the minimum for what you can do for yourself. Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the time. I don't know that I'm so concerned all the time in that way of like legacy. I'm very in the moment, kind of on a spiritual level. But yeah, I hope that the big picture is that people are like, whoa, this is a person who like tried a bunch of shit, and like I can try shit too.
It's okay to try.
Yeah.
Yeah. What advice would you have for young artists coming up that are trying to figure out those things? What advice would you give them on this journey?
Take yourself seriously. And I just started doing it. But I've been saying it as my advice for a long time. But I'm telling you, it's lit. It's lit where you're just like, oh, I started a newsletter. I'm like, I love doing my newsletter. I started my runs. I love my runs. I started spending more time with friends, and taking those relationships really seriously, and taking my potential as a good friend very seriously. And I think that all those things lend themselves to a good artistic practice. I think all those things lend themselves to a really profound creative practice, because it is so much about audacity, and you can't teach it. You have to nurture it.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for coming to sit with us and sharing. It's been a very refreshing morning.
Was I better than Tyler the Creator?